continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
A Beauty to Save the Scarred Duke. Written by Leah Conolly and published by Starfall Publications. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy. Prologue. Duncan woke in his bedchamber, disoriented. The dream had been terrible, full of darkness and flames and screaming. In the dream he'd been trapped, running around trying desperately to find a way out of a terrifying place, and now he sat up in his own bed, gulping for fresh air and steadying his heart. But the air wasn't fresh. Even here, escaped at last from the dream world, there was a thick cloud of smoke lingering in the air. He shook his head as though to clear it, and in a moment was fully awake. It wasn't the remnants of a bad dream curling fingers around his mind. There really was smoke curling in from under the door. He could see a red light moving beneath the crack, and it backlit a shadow of thick smoke pluming into the room, making it hard to breathe. That's when he heard it. The last vestige of his dream that he now realized was reality. The sound of a woman's scream, his mother's scream. Duncan threw himself from his bed at once, stumbling free of the coverlet and running in his nightshirt to the door. He had the presence of mind to test the handle to be certain of heat. There was none. The fire, wherever it was in the home, was not yet crouching outside his door. He opened the door and stepped into the hall. There was the source of the red light, flickering fiercely in the west wing of the vast manor, where he had grown up his entire life, which he had only just taken over management of a few years prior. The West Wing was the beautiful and ornate place he had prepared for his father and mother to live comfortably with him into their old age. There came her scream again, and this time he heard his name echoed amid the crackling of flames and the sound of something breaking ahead of him. Duncan! He ran now, stopping only to snatch one of the fire buckets full of sand from the alcove nearest the West Wing. As he turned down the hall towards his parents' chamber, he felt the heat intensify, scalding his skin. The smoke was thick. He held a handkerchief to his nose and mouth and pressed on. He stepped into his mother's solar and saw her there, far away from him against the wall in her own room. 2 doorways separated them, but he could not see his father anywhere. He lunged towards her, but at the first doorway, wreathed with flames, he felt a sharp burning on his side and turned to see that his nightshirt had caught fire and was quickly wicking into flame. He pushed forward towards his mother, who seemed to grow more distant, obscured as she was by smoke. Then the agony of the flames climbing to his neck and face forced him to fight back, trying to put out the fire. The noise was overwhelming, the pain beyond belief, and above it all was the knowledge that his parents were in there, caught up in the inferno, and he could not reach them. He tried to breathe but couldn't, and the world faded to black. It was hours before he awoke again. He was laying down outside the manor, covered in a blanket. Something was falling lightly on him, and it took Duncan a moment to realize that it was rain mixed with ash. He struggled to sit up, but cried out at the shooting pain that ran from his ribs to his face. A figure moved in the darkness, and he heard the voice of his valet near at hand. "Lie still, my lord. We have called for the doctor, and the constables are here. You are much injured." "You saved me." He could barely speak the words, his throat hoarse and scratched by smoke. The young man nodded, his face now sober in the light. Duncan turned and looked towards the manor. The West Wing reared its head in the queer half-light of torches and dying flames, a blackened silhouette. "We were able to contain the flames to the one side of the manor," the valet said quietly. "My parents," Duncan said, struggling to his feet. "I saw them." He turned agonized eyes to the servant at his side and saw there a broken man. He spoke softly, his words slicing into Duncan. "I could only save you, my lord." Chapter 1. Amelia, at his return, presently perceived the disturbance in his mind, though he endeavoured with his utmost power to hide it, and he was at length prevailed upon by her entreaties to discover to her the cause of it. Isadora sighed and closed the cover of the book, looking up at her sisters wearily. I confess that, though I treasure books above most pleasures in the world, Henry Fielding's exhortation on the long-suffering Amelia never has managed to awaken my true interest. He is a well-respected author, her father interjected from his chair by the fire, pulling his pipe out of his mouth and gesturing with it. And you did say that during these readings we could choose the occasional book. I think Fielding himself would appreciate a bit of dialogue on the subject, Isadora rejoined with an impish smile. Perhaps he would have enjoyed hearing my opinion on the rather narrow-minded way he addresses the female condition. Or perhaps, her sister Eliza rejoined with raised eyebrows, he would hold to his opinions on the female condition and not judge you worthy of a retort. Eliza was older than Isadora by 4 years, and had used the difference in their ages to establish the high ground in most moral and philosophical discussions. It was Clara, only 17 years to Isadora's 18, who was more likely to defend her sister, and she did so now, leaning forward with bright eyes. It is rather hard that Amelia must be so discredited merely because she has broken her nose, she said. Isadora nodded. Precisely. I do not think so highly of outward looks as to think them worthy of society's censure. That is something that you have the freedom to say, Eliza corrected her, because you happen to be a very pretty woman. She gestured with the needle of her embroidery and Isadora's features. Isadora smiled and turned back to the pages wearily. In truth, it was Eliza and Clara who had inherited their father's handsome qualities, all loveliness with their pale, curling hair and blue eyes. Isadora took after her mother's slight form, willowy, with brown hair and green eyes. She had inherited her father's quick wit and sharp mind, and she wondered if it was that, or her resemblance to her mother, that so endeared her to him. As she thought of her mother, who had died only a few years ago after falling ill, a lump formed in her throat, and the words on the page seemed to dance before her eyes. She did not like for her family to see her emotion. Eliza was the one prone to hysterics and bouts of feeling, Clara too impressionable. And though she knew her father tried to be strong, Isadora also knew how sorely he had taken her mother's passing. She paused, gathering her emotions, but Eliza misunderstood her silence. You may well try to be imperious about this, she interjected, but I assure you, looks matter more than you think. I know that I would never settle for marriage to a man who was unattractive, and I don't think that even Fielding's Amelia would have done so. Her Mr. Booth was the most handsome of men, and perhaps that accounted for her fervent defence of him. Clara sat up a little straighter and chirped, I don't know that it was a defence, so much as it was a blind loyalty. She chose for so long not to see his flaws. Don't we all? Eliza asked. We choose to overlook what we do not like in a person's personality in order to make things more comfortable. Isadora looked up, her tears, so dangerously near the surface a moment before, now safely tucked away. I think we overlook a person's physical failings, as well as those of their personality. In truth, I could more easily find affection for a person who was unattractive and kind than for a cruel, yet handsome man. That explains your stance on Lord Dunmay, Eliza said dryly. That's enough. Isadora's father put his pipe back in his mouth, speaking around it with a firm expression. I hardly think the daughter of a baron need be scolded for choosing to forego the suit of a young man she dislikes. Isadora does not appreciate Ernest Chapman, and so she should not have to suffer his presence. Isadora looked at her father, grateful that in this area he seemed to show her a leniency many daughters did not receive from their fathers. He had been one of the few people, aside from Clara, who had understood when she called off her courtship to Ernest only a few weeks after its beginning. She folded the book closed firmly. I do think, she said with a smile, that we've read enough for today. I'm of half a mind to find some poems for our future reading. Fielding seems too dreary for spring weather and feelings. She turned to her sisters. I am going out on a walk. Would you care to join me? Eliza shook her head. I heard there might be rain later, and I'd rather forgo such a damp end to my day. Clara stood eagerly. "I shall brave the rain with you," she said, hurrying off to fetch a cloak for her and Isadora both. They started out along the road together, walking from their father's manor in the undulating valley up to the spread of trees where they often stood and surveyed the village beyond. As the Baron of Essex, their father was a well-respected gentleman. His estate was not vast by any means, and with the economic downturn, Isadora knew he worried about its future. But for now it was simply a pretty piece of land, and there was great pleasure in walking the length of it. That is, the walk began with great pleasure, but diminished almost as soon as they crested the hill, for a familiar figure was making his way towards them with long, overconfident strides. "Imagine that," Clara said softly. "We speak about him, and he appears." "It is a backward sort of fortune," Isadora agreed quietly. Ernest Chapman was generally thought to be a handsome man. Although Isadora found his height and broad shoulders, accompanied with shoulder-length black hair and blue eyes, to be much disturbed in her memory by the overbearing way he spoke to her in particular, and all people when they did not go along with his manner. During their brief courtship, she'd found him to be far from the man she'd imagined. They'd met during the last London season, but what she had thought to be endearing confidence had in fact been a deep arrogance and a vicious nature that she could not help but distrust. He had not taken no for an answer when she'd begun to protest his behaviour, and when she'd finally turned him down for good, they had parted ways most disconcertingly. He did not seem to think she was serious, could not imagine that any woman would be able to turn away from him. It was with that same garish charm that he now bowed to the two sisters, touching a finger to his cap. "How fortuitous," he said. "I was just coming to see you." "If that is your reason in coming," Isadora said calmly, remembering some of the calloused things he had said to her during her refusal. "I am sorry to disappoint you. I am on a walk with my sister at present and cannot spare a moment for conversation." That dangerous, dark look flashed from his eyes for a moment, but was replaced by a restrained smile that reeked of hidden motives. It was that very smile that had first made Isadora wary of their courtship. "If you cannot spare a moment for an old friend, I suppose I will have to continue on to my other objective, a moment of conversation with your father." "Father may also be indisposed," Isadora answered him in a note of warning. "I would not want you to risk the walk." He said nothing in response to this, but continued on down the hill, away from the two sisters. "I do not know how he can be so persistent, when you clearly do not wish any sort of connection to be formed between the two of you," Clara said with a sad smile. "It is as though you are talking, and he hears nothing." "One of the many reasons I do not wish to speak with him or about him," Isadora said, looping her arm through her sister's. "Every time I see him, he reinforces what I already suspected, that we are too different to ever be engaged or even married. He has proven to me time and again that he is cold and untrustworthy. I want a man of values, with a kind heart." "Such a man exists, I am certain," Clara said with youthful eagerness. "But for now, we need not speak any more of the gentleman that certainly does not hold those values." The two sisters continued their walk with happier topics, but when they ended up again at the front door of the manor, they met Ernest coming out of the door. He looked very different, his charm completely gone, his eyes flashing and dark. He stopped short in front of Isadora and did not bow or even touch his hat in respect. He only locked eyes with her in a way that made her feel quite small and said with icy clarity, "We are not done yet, Miss Hastings." Before she could respond, he had already walked away from her down the lane. The two sisters looked at each other in silent question and then turned together to make their way into the house. Eliza was just inside, but she shook her head at their questions and shrugged. "I know nothing," she said. "But Isadora, Father wishes to see you privately in his study as soon as you return." Isadora went there at once, pushing open the door to see her father sitting with his back towards her. He turned at the sound of her nearness, and she saw a wrinkle of worry on his forehead. "Lord Dunmay?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "He came to ask for your hand," he said quietly. She sat down in a chair, folding her hands in her lap. "I just encountered him outside in the courtyard. I believe from his reaction that you did not give him a favourable answer." He shook his head. "I will not marry you to such a man. His very insolence in response is enough to convince me that it is not a good idea. A man who cannot control his temper or manners enough to respect his elders, and the woman he wishes to woo is not worth your attention." Isadora leaned forward gratefully. "It was right of you to express yourself thusly," she said with a smile. "You need not look so distressed, father. I would not have wished his hand for the world." "It is not the refusal that frustrates me," Lord Hastings said quietly. "My daughter, he mentioned how fortuitous it would be for my estate. Somehow he has found information about how the baronage is doing, and he might very well use it against me." "I know that things have been difficult," Isadora said slowly. "But is it as bad as all that?" Her father was usually honest with her, more honest than he was even with his other daughters. She saw his face fall. "The estate is bankrupt," he said hoarsely. "Oh, father." She stood and came to his side, kneeling down and taking his hand in hers. "I did not know." "As much as I hate to admit it, he is right about one thing. The only way to save it now would be for you to marry well." He shook his head. "I just can't do it. I cannot see my little Izzy go away with that man." Isadora set her chin. "You won't have to, father. It will not be Lord Dunmay, but he is not the only wealthy gentleman available to a titled woman such as myself. Do not give up hope. Perhaps I can marry another." "I would not wish for you to leave girlhood behind so soon," he said softly, pressing her hand in his. She did not answer outright, but in her heart Isadora made a quiet determination to help her family the only way that was presented to her, a fine marriage, one that would make her father proud and protect her sisters for future alliances. Chapter 2. "My lord," Georges, Duncan's valet, now turned butler, bowed at the entrance to the vast library where Duncan spent much of his days. "The Marquis of Wellington is here to see you." Duncan looked up with a start. He had been standing by the window for some time, his hands folded behind him, staring out on the grounds outside, lost in remembrances. He turned wearily. "Tell Daniel I do not wish to see him." Daniel was his oldest and dearest friend, and yet in the 2 years since the fire, Duncan had found it harder and harder to be around the people who had known him before the tragedy. In some cases, the problem solved itself. Most people were willing to slip quietly out of his life to avoid looking upon his physical and emotional scars. But Daniel Carson was persistent. Georges, too, stayed. The estate called for a vast staff, but Duncan had let all go, except for a cook, a maid, and the 2 footmen required to keep it cleaned and operational. The remaining staff were permitted to stay, only if they kept away from gossip in the village and completely avoided the west wing where Duncan slept every night. The structural damage was mostly on the far end of the wing, and so he had a bed brought into the nearer edge, the room where he'd last seen his mother. Georges had protested, Daniel had protested, and the doctor had protested, but in the end Duncan had roared out that he wanted everything left as it was. The cup his mother had last drunk from lay on the floor. His father's books against the wall were charred and reeked of death, but Duncan felt it was where he belonged. He ought to have been the one to perish in that fire, but he had lived, and they had not. Now, with scars covering half of his face, and even crawling down to his ribs where no eye could see, he felt he had more in common with the hollowed-out part of the building than the land of the living. Even Georges, who was the only person allowed daily access into Duncan's life, was not permitted in the west wing of the building. Now he pursed his lips together and looked at Duncan with gentle pity. "My lord, I do not expect Lord Wellington to so easily leave. It has been some time since you have seen him, or anyone for that matter." "And why is that, I ask you?" Duncan growled, whirling on the other man. Do you remember what happened the last time I went out in public? Do you remember the lovely Lady Catherine of Elmshire? Her beauty was renowned, and I was a lucky man, for she was willing to court me, to marry me. Then I limped back into her life after the tragedy, and she took one look at me and thought the courtship an unsavoury idea. Georges winced. Duncan knew it was not his fault, but he pressed on harshly. Do you know what she said to me? She said that my appearance was too severe to ignore. I would not submit the rest of society to that same fate. Ah, but I am not the rest of society, came a quiet voice from behind Georges. Daniel stepped into the room, trustworthy, loyal Daniel. He turned and smiled kindly to the butler. That will be all, Georges. Georges looked a little relieved and took his leave of the two. Duncan turned away from his friend, hiding the scarred side of his face. He'd grown a beard up around the scars, but even that was not enough to hide his disfiguration. The gold-brown hue of his hair only reminded him of his mother. You're a good man, Daniel said softly, drawing near. But you are letting this tragedy turn you into a hardened brute. You should not keep your distance from other people. We will be the ones to keep you human. Your efforts to get me out of the house will not be successful today, Duncan said curtly. I think it laughable that you believe the solution to this deformity is to drag me to balls and social events. I never wish to be seen in public again. I detest the pity and the criticism. Lady Catherine was foppish and ignorant. You are lucky to have seen those things before you were wed to her, Daniel said. Do not speak her name here, Duncan snapped. He paused a moment, guilt stabbing him. I am sorry, Daniel, he added wearily. I know you do not mean anything by it. Your loyalty is a gift I do not deserve. Perhaps in this kinder frame of mind you might consider the proposition I have brought before you today, Daniel said, a note of playfulness in his voice. I have a friend in the county over, Baron Hastings of Essex. He is looking for a suitor for his daughter, Isadora. She's a pretty little thing and quite bright, although I've not had the pleasure of speaking with her as much as I would like. Perhaps you would consider courting again. Not all women are like Lady Catherine. If she is indeed a pretty little thing, I cannot imagine that she would want to be confined to a life with me, Duncan said quietly. And you are smart enough to know that. What is wrong with her, that her father would think me a suitable candidate? Daniel looked for a moment as though he meant to protest, but then he lowered his gaze. Her father is in great need, about to lose everything. Duncan nodded, pursing his lips together. So, he is willing to sell his daughter to a beast to preserve his fortune? You are not a beast. I recommended you based not only on your money but on your character and personality. He wants someone kind and moral for his daughter. That speaks more highly of him than anything else. Duncan shook his head. I trust that they are good people, if you care for them. I will offer him a loan, but nothing more. I would not condemn any woman, even one I had never met, to this. Chapter 3. Father, what was the Marquis doing here? Isadora asked, stopping by the window to watch the retreating figure of a gentleman on horseback, one of her father's acquaintances. Baron Hastings looked up from a bundle of papers he had been examining on his desk. It was only he and Isadora in the front parlour, and when he seemed satisfied of the fact, he motioned her nearer. Carson heard about our situation and has offered assistance. I thought he meant to set up a no-interest loan, perhaps, but in truth he has just arrived with a rather large sum of money from Lord Grant, a gentleman one county over who— I know who he is, Isadora said quietly. It was impossible not to have heard about the horrible tragedy at the Grant estate 2 years ago. She had not known the family personally, but the London season following had been full of talk about the fire and the ruined son who now took up a life of isolation. Why should he help us? The Baron looked back at the papers. He writes that he is an investor in some of our mutton business, but that seems a frail excuse. I suspect he is just a good man who wants to help a fellow man of title. Lord Wellington arranged it. We should call on him, Isadora said at once, a kernel of interest opening in her heart. We should thank him in person. I have not yet decided if I will accept it, the Baron answered slowly. It is a shocking sum of money, and beyond that my health is not at present good enough for me to travel. Father, Isadora said, coming close and smiling tenderly at him. I know that your pride is very great, but I do not think that we have a choice in accepting the money. If you do not, the family will be ruined. And I would not think about having you travel all that way. It would be an easy trip for me to make, and I could take one of my sisters with me for propriety's sake. The Baron shook his head and looked at the note bearing the sum of money that had been given him. It does seem as though such a gift requires some manner of response. I shall go to him, Isadora said with a smile. I will write at once to announce our coming. Izzy. He frowned up at her. I have not met him, but it is rumoured that the fire that killed his parents wounded him as well. I know. She took a step back and forced a smile. I am not frightened of a few scars. Clara and Isadora departed the next day. It was only a morning's journey to the nearby estate, but the spring weather, so tentative the week before, had taken a turn back to winter, as it always did this time of year. The carriage had to go along the road rather slowly, but Isadora found she did not mind. She pulled back the curtain and looked out on the passing fields, blanketed with a growing covering of snow. It was magical, in a silent sort of way. Do you think he will be very frightening? Clara asked quietly. I have heard things from my friends in the city. You mustn't listen to gossip, Isadora said, although in truth she had wondered the same. There will be scars, though. We ought not to stare at them. I have heard competing rumours about him, Clara went on regardless. Some say that he is charitable and tries to help other people, just as he has helped our father, but others say that he is quite cold and distant, a cruel man. Isadora had heard the same rumours, but did not know what to believe. It is best to allow him to make his own impression, she said gently. They turned the corner at last and rode down a long lane towards the main estate. It was far grander than she had expected, a lone building surrounded by only a few trees. The estate had a few tenant homes, but she had seen no one walking out and about, no grazing horses, no fields with sheep or cattle sheltering from the snow. It seemed very lonely and very quiet. The snow made the west end of the building stand out even blacker against the landscape, half burnt and diminished. Why don't they clean that burnt part away? Clara breathed gently. It is none of our affair, Isadora answered, denying her own curiosity. The carriage drew up at last at the front door, and a tall footman opened the door to let them out. Isadora drew a deep breath and stepped out into the cold, crisp air. Chapter 4. He wanted to be inside, watching from some window, but George had convinced him that it was fitting and proper to greet his guests from the front steps. In truth, Duncan had felt terrified when he first received notice that Baron Hastings was sending his daughter for a brief meeting after receipt of the money. He remembered her only vaguely from the sort of grand London gatherings he had attended before the tragedy, but they had never spoken, and he knew that she would not remember him. He hoped she had heard about his appearance and would not be too frightened, and yet at the same time it made him sick to think she might be fearful of the meeting because of gossip. He took a deep breath as the door of the carriage opened and straightened his face. 2 women stepped out of the carriage. The first had pale blonde hair and large blue eyes. She was younger, and even before Isadora stepped out of the carriage, Duncan knew that the first girl must be the little sister, Clara. She curtsied, but looked anywhere but his face. Isadora, on the other hand, cut a different figure. She was not so tall, but was very slight and pretty, with soft brown hair curling out from under her riding bonnet and bright, intelligent eyes. She walked directly towards him and curtsied only a few feet away, as would have been proper if he had not been a maimed man. She looked directly at his face, showing no signs of flinching, and smiled prettily, nearly knocking the wind out of him with her beauty. Lord Grant. What a privilege that you should allow us to appear at your manor so unexpectedly. It is my honour to be here in your presence and to properly thank you for what you have done for my family." He was taken aback and bowed more out of proper habit than conscious thought. "The honour is all mine." He wondered if he was standing in a bit of shadow, if she'd somehow missed his horribly disfigured face. "Do come inside." He turned on his heel and heard them following close at hand behind them. He knew that it was proper under such circumstances to offer tidbits of conversation, but he could think of nothing. It had been so long since he had had guests, so long since anyone, much less a beautiful woman, had looked him directly in the eyes. He was caught off guard, flailing for what was the proper course of action. He turned in the lounge and watched them walk inside. Clara seemed thankful of the French interior, looking at it with wide eyes instead of at his face. Isadora's expression lit with appreciation as they took their seats. "It is quite lovely," she said with a smile. "It was my mother's wish to have the home decorated thusly," he said, wincing inwardly at the mention of his parents. Isadora seemed not to notice. "The ride was quite pleasant," she said with a smile. "I love the snow, and have been almost sad to see winter giving way to spring so soon this year." He didn't know what to say to that, blushing a little at the realization that all his powers of casual conversation seemed to have fled. She waited a moment, and then blessedly pressed on with conversation. "I will explain the reason I wish to meet you at once, and not hold you in suspense any longer. I wish to thank you for your help. I did not think a letter would suffice, and my father did not either. He would have insisted on coming himself, if his health had permitted, but I will try to put into words what he communicated to me. Lord Grant, your gift was more than a simple investment. It will likely save my father's estate. It has turned around my sister's fortunes. For that, we are eternally grateful." He nodded, listening as she went on to talk about her father's estate and the business therein. He found her both kind and eloquent, and yet it seemed strange to him to have such a beautiful young woman sitting in his drawing room, speaking to him as though he were any normal man. He waited and listened. Chapter 5. Isadora watched the man's face carefully as she talked. He was indeed scarred, so dreadfully that she had been taken aback when she first climbed out of the carriage. But with wonderment she soon realized that it was not the scars that kept her attention so focused on his face. Duncan Grant had light brown hair, almost gold in this light, and eyes like the sky in summer. He dressed simply, yet she could see how masculine and strong he was beneath the fabric of his coat. More than that, she could see an emotion buried deep in those eyes. She wondered if it was physical pain, or if there was something more that he was hiding. When he spoke, his voice was deep and smooth, but guarded. "Money means very little to me," he said quietly. "I am glad it could be of assistance, but I would not wish your father to think himself in my debt." It was well said and kindly meant. Isadora nodded. "You are gracious." A light flickered in the mystery of those eyes, and something almost like a smile tugged at a corner of his mouth. "What I am," he said quietly, "is interested in you, Miss Hastings." She felt a sudden urge to lower her eyes for the first time in their meeting. A blush climbed into her cheeks. "Ask me whatever you desire, my lord. I would be happy to satisfy your curiosity." "What are your interests?" Isadora felt Clara shift uncomfortably beside her. She could see that her little sister, although kind-hearted, was having difficulty reconciling the face of the man before her. She spoke quickly, hoping Duncan would not notice her sister's fear. "I've always been rather interested in herbal medicine," she said with a forced smile, "and anything else that can be learned from the written word." "You like books?" He raised his eyebrows. "They do offer a certain escape, do they not?" That was it. The thing Isadora had seen lingering in the man's eyes. A darkness that spoke not of escape, but of a desire to linger in the sadness that surrounded him. The tragedy had scarred more than his face. He had all the markings of a good man, even a kind man, but he did not look as though he thought himself either of these. He looked like a man that wanted to remember every moment of the pain he had endured, a man that was afraid of forgetting more than he was afraid of the pain of remembering. "Yes," she said slowly, wrestling with these observations. "Books are a gift. Come with me." He stood abruptly, and if Isadora had not followed suit at once, pulling Clara with her, she was certain she would have lost sight of him, so quickly did he move out of the room and to the hall beyond. He led them down a few halls to a much larger room. It took Isadora a moment to realize that it was a library. She'd never seen a library so large or so lovely. The room was circular, like a ballroom, but unlike a ballroom, the walls were devoted to learning and not frippery. The books were all around it on high shelves, and a ladder ran on a track around the outer edge to allow easy access. Large windows with drapes broke up some of the lower shelves and filled the room with a pretty easy light. She drew in her breath at once at the beauty of it all. "I could stay here all day," she said. She added in a quieter tone, "I could perhaps stay here a lifetime and not make it through all these books." She looked up and caught him watching her with a strange expression. He cleared his throat. "Follow me," he said again, leading them from the library to a room adjacent that was much smaller, although equally as well lit, with only a few pieces of furniture, polished wooden floors, and walls lined as if in a museum with paintings. Duncan stopped beneath a painting of two people, a man and a woman, sitting beside one another. "My parents," he said quietly. "Are all these paintings of people in your family?" she asked quietly. He nodded. Isadora felt a sudden breeze and turned towards a door that opened into the hall. She wasn't certain if it was her imagination or not, but she thought for a moment she smelled smoke, tasting ash on her tongue. She took a step towards the hall and the darkness beyond, knowing instinctively that she was moving westward. "We don't have long," Duncan said suddenly abruptly. "I have more of the house to show you, and we mustn't stall here." His tone took on a hard edge. "Or there," he said, nodding towards the hall. Isadora nodded and drew away from the door, a lump forming in her throat. She couldn't say why, but a deep curiosity to see what lay beyond that hall, what lay to the west, was growing inside of her. Chapter 6. The day ended after the tour of the house and a brief conversation over tea. Duncan walked his two guests outside, pained more than he cared to admit by the evident relief in Clara's face when she climbed safely back into the carriage. He was even more pained by how empty his house seemed when he stepped back inside after they had gone. The next day, Daniel came to pay his friend a visit. Duncan was upstairs in the west wing when George came to announce his presence. The butler stood at the end of the hall as he always did, not actually stepping past into the charred building, and called out that Daniel was waiting downstairs. Duncan found his friend standing in the parlour, leaning on the mantelpiece. He turned with a smile. "How did your visit go?" he asked without prelude. Duncan gave a weak smile and came to sit beside his friend. "You don't waste any time." "Why should I, when one of my oldest and dearest friends finally allows a young lady to pay him a visit? It is as though all my good advice is finally being heeded." "Don't flatter yourself," Duncan said with a wave of his hand. "Miss Hastings did not come so that I might woo her. She came of her own accord to thank me for my hand in her father's rescue, and she left the same day. It was fairly uneventful."
Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
Daniel came and sat down across from his friend, his eyes interested. "You don't seem as horrified as I would have imagined. Am I to suppose that the visit went better than you'd anticipated?" Duncan remembered the way she had looked at him, those green eyes, frank and unassuming. She hadn't shrunk from his visage or behaved as though the sight of his scars was a hardship, but he had no way of knowing if her face had been a reflection of her true feelings or only a mask. "She was a pleasant young lady, as you said. well engaged in conversation and interested in the tour of the home. More than that I cannot say. What you are avoiding saying is much more meaningful to me, Daniel said quietly. You are not talking about any strong reaction. Is it possible that she was not as horrified by your appearance as you suspected her to be? She was a decent and elegant woman, Duncan said quietly, and before you crow too much over your correctness, I will have you know that her little sister accompanied her and was much alarmed by my appearance. It is not the little sister that interests me. Daniel sat down across from his friend. Miss Hastings is a lovely woman, is she not? Is it possible that you might have found a person at last who can look past the scars that so occupy your every thought? Duncan grit his jaw. It is a madman's notion, my friend, and though I respect the heart that suggests it, I cannot indulge the idea further. Did you come today to pry into my love life only? If so, I think it proper that you should show yourself out. Daniel smiled casually. I came to shoot archery with you in the back garden, far away from the lane, if you're worried about exposure. The discussion of your love life is only an added benefit. The two friends walked out and set up in their usual habit at one end of the thickly hedged garden. There was a wide open expanse of groomed field between them and a hedge maze in the distance, and that space was dotted with only a few shaded trees and garden patches. At the far end, with a clear shot from where they set up with bow and arrow, there were a series of 5 targets, neatly arranged. Duncan was a fine shot, better even than Daniel. While Daniel perhaps had more opportunity to hunt socially, Duncan had little to occupy his time except solitary pursuits, and he had practiced archery all his life. He drew back an arrow and let it fly, wincing as it landed just shy of centre. You're losing your touch, Daniel teased him. Or are your thoughts occupied elsewhere? You said we could shoot in silence, Duncan said. I said no such thing. Daniel set an arrow of his own to the string and pulled it back, letting it fly to the target. I am too good of a friend to let you dismiss a good match as madness without further reproof. Duncan set another arrow to the string and held his weapon up, sighting towards the target, but into his head at once came exactly what he had been avoiding, an image of Isadora Hastings, slim and pale, emerald eyes, sharp intellect, wandering wide-eyed through his family library. He let the bow drop without loosing the arrow. I could never condemn a woman to a life like mine, he said quietly. It would be solitary, and one day she would do as I have and look at me and realize, no matter what money I possess, that I am hideous at the core. Daniel shook his head and looked at his friend. May I offer you some advice? Even if I denied you, I suspect you would, Duncan retorted dryly. I would tell you to move past the matter of your scars, Daniel shrugged. From what you say, she certainly has. Chapter 7. Isadora shook the mixture around in a small tincture bottle and held it up to the light, watching the oils swirl through the pale brown glass. The smell of lavender filled the little kitchen where she had put together the little remedy. She tucked the bottle into the concealed pocket in her day dress, just as a step sounded in the hallway outside, and she looked up to Eliza standing there in the doorway. What are you doing here? Her sister asked. That gentleman you and father seem to think so highly of is arriving any minute now, and it would hardly do for any of Baron Hastings' daughters to be found in the kitchens before an official tea. Isadora nodded and forced a smile. Her sisters still did not know the extent of the financial troubles her family had faced, although Clara had guessed some from her chaperoning of Isadora's visit to Lord Grant's manor, and so Isadora knew Eliza did not understand why their father would have any desire to ask the maimed son of tragedy and fallen society to their home for tea. When Isadora had heard of the invitation, she was delighted, but hardly suspected to receive a favourable response. She had enjoyed her visit to the manor, however mysterious, but the impression she had received from Duncan was that of a man well acquainted with his own grief and ill-fitted for society. Still, he had written back accepting the invitation, and was to arrive that very day. She followed Eliza upstairs but paused at one of the looking-glasses to self-consciously touch her hair. It had been quite prim and proper earlier that morning when she'd bound it round with a green ribbon to coordinate with her day gown, but the ribbon had slipped and wisps were falling out around her face in soft curls. She pulled the ribbon free completely and tucked it into the pocket with the tincture bottle. It was not much better, but it would have to do. Just then, the door opened in the foyer nearby, and she heard the sound of her father's voice and that of their family butler, showing a guest into the house she knew must be Lord Grant. She took up a place just behind Eliza, and a little in front of Clara, and the girls curtsied when their visitor stepped into the room. Lord Grant had dressed more elegantly for the tea visit than Isadora would have expected, judging from the simplicity of his attire during her time at his manor. He wore a tailored suit coat, fitted trousers, and a lace cravat. His golden hair was combed back from his face, his beard trimmed, and though his scars were still pulling at one half of his face, she thought with a start that he looked decidedly handsome standing there in her family home. In fact, he looked so fine that it seemed to make the homegrown nature of her childhood estate turn shabby about her. She curtsied and dropped her eyes when she felt his fall on her, a blush coming into her cheeks. "You are so welcome," her father was saying cheerfully, waving towards his daughters. "I believe you know my Isadora and Clara, but here is my eldest, Miss Eliza Hastings." "A pleasure," Lord Grant said, bowing to each and taking their hand. Isadora wondered if it was her imagination that his hand seemed to linger a moment longer on hers, but when she met his eyes, she was distracted by the jewel blue in their depths. It drove all other thoughts for a moment from her mind. The man then turned and followed her father into the tea room. Isadora moved as well, but Eliza seized her arm and whispered in a low voice, "You didn't tell me that he was so disfigured. The man looks like a melted candle." "That is very uncharitable of you," Isadora shot back in a low tone. "I am surprised that you did not notice his fine manners and bearing." Eliza looked at Isadora with raised eyebrows. "You can train manners into any beast, but it makes them no less a beast." Isadora jerked her arm away and walked after her father. She heard Clara whisper a few words of reproof behind her, but could not catch what they were. When she came into the room and sat down across from the gentleman, she couldn't help but think how very small and quaint everything must seem. They had shared tea with Lord Grant in an arched room that was more a ballroom than a parlour, and now her family was offering their very finest in what would have perhaps been a simple solar for him. She felt a stab of worry that it would seem an insult to the luxuries with which the gentleman was familiar, but he seemed not to notice. He accepted the tea offered him with a smile, his eyes drifting for a moment to Isadora's face and then fixing back on Baron Hastings. "It was a pretty ride here," he said in deep, smooth tones. "Your daughters spoke to me about the views, and I did not believe them. In my younger days I never looked to the right or to the left when I rode from town to town, always too intent on the destination to enjoy the journey." "We are all guilty of that in our younger days," Baron Hastings said graciously. "But as we grow older and experience the lack of beauty, we appreciate its presence all the more." Isadora worried that this comment, though poignant, would bring to their guests' mind the memories of his own loss and lack. She need not have worried, for he turned and spoke to her instead. "Not all of us are guilty of that in our youth," he said with something that nearly amounted to a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Your daughter spoke to me of the beauty herself, and that was on a day riddled with white snow, when there ought to have been springtime." Isadora blushed despite herself and looked at her hands. She felt her father's eyes upon her, and then heard him say, "Well, Isadora has always been sensitive to such romantic notions of nature and beauty. I blame it on all the books she carries about with her. Those modern poets are so consumed with the air and the wind and the perfection of the world." "On the contrary, father," Isadora answered with a gentle smile, "I hardly think the modern are poets so consumed as to overlook the hardships. Those that I appreciate, Blake for instance, are as engaged with thoughts of the darkness of the world as thoughts of beauty. The difficult things make the beautiful more precious, as you said yourself earlier." Their visitor smiled and looked down at his teacup. "Tiger, tiger, burning bright," he began quietly. "In the forest of the night," she finished for him, delighted to have heard him quote one of her favourites from the illuminated manuscript. "That is just what I was thinking of, Lord Grant, an example of Blake writing about something quite dark, but contrasting it with beauty." He smiled at her for a beat longer than was perfectly proper, and then turned his attention again to her father. The conversation went on like that for a few hours, comfortable and easy. He was more engaging than he had been with only her and Clara, and she wondered vaguely if he had grown more comfortable after their visit, and what might have prompted that. She found that rather than feeling chagrined by his appearance, she was finding it more and more difficult to look away from his crystal eyes and his bright expressions. She felt something in her heart that had never before been touched beginning to give way, little by little. When it came time to go, she walked outside with the family and bid him farewell. When he reached to take her hand, she had the vial of lavender oil slipped inside. She held his hand for an instant, registering the expression of surprise on his face. "Just a few drops, mixed with oil, will help to lessen the pain," she said quietly. She knew that she had spoken softly enough that her family could not hear, and yet she feared that he would take the mention of his scars as an insult. Instead, his eyes looked so suddenly full of emotion that he seemed to be very near tears. He blinked them away and took a deep breath, gently pressing her hand before pulling back with the vial in his own. "I thank you for your kindness, my lady," he said nobly. Then he turned and in a voice clear enough that the others could hear added, "I enjoy your company excessively. Please consider coming to my manor for a longer stay, a weekend perhaps, now that the weather is improving." He took his leave then, but she stood outside and watched until his carriage had turned the lane and was entirely out of sight. Chapter 8. Duncan wasn't certain how much to expect on the matter of the Hastings' acceptance of his invitation, but it seemed that the conversation with Baron Hastings had done much good, for only a week later he received word that the entire family would be coming to the manor for a weekend visit. As much as he wanted to see Isadora again, he nearly panicked and cancelled the entire thing at the thought of hosting such an event, for the first time since his family's death. But in the end, Daniel talked him out of it. "I will be there," he said with a smile. "Just have me over for the weekend as well, and I will make certain that nothing goes awry. It is only a little visit. Nothing significant need happen." Armed with that reassurance, Duncan sent a carriage to collect the Hastings family and set up rooms in the far eastern wing of the manor so that they were the furthest away from his own living quarters and the burnt west wing. It was strange. After more than 2 years of isolation and obsession, he was finding that just a little bit of exposure to Isadora had made him less satisfied crawling back into the wing where his parents had died. Yet he still could not fully separate himself. He was unwilling to turn his back on the memory of all that he had lost for the sake of a woman, especially when he knew women to be so fickle in their affections. The first night was a short one. The family came late and merely had some light refreshments before turning into bed. It was the next morning that dawned unusually warm and sunny for the early spring that brought the real revelries. Duncan had a tent erected in the back garden to shield them from the hot sun, as well as a badminton net and some other games for the lawn. The cook, who had been serving him a rather uninspired meal of stew and mutton for years, was at last able to make some delicacies worthy of a small house party, and Daniel was there in all his charming glory. The main benefit of Daniel, Duncan found, was that his friend was always available to take the attention of the other 2 Hastings sisters, Clara and Eliza, who seemed eager to look upon a more handsome face. Duncan hoped that this would allow him some alone time with Isadora, who was looking all fresh and lovely in a white muslin gown that capped her shoulders neatly and brushed along the tips of the long green grass like a caress. However, his attentions were still much engaged with her father, who was a most intelligent and kind man who seemed completely ignorant of Duncan's desires to get Isadora away from the crowd. He was content to sit in the shade with his daughter and Duncan and talk about business and politics and the workings of the international world. To Duncan's surprise, Isadora did not slip away when these topics arose. She had clearly been raised and respected by her father, such that she considered herself fully able to engage in the conversation, ask questions, and even provide answers. Duncan knew such behaviour would be considered blue-stocking by some, but he found it only another attractive part of the woman's personality. "Do you often see your tenants?" Baron Hastings asked at one point during the day. "I have heard that it is most important to keep one's finger on the pulse of one's estate. I only have a few tenants, and them good friends of the family, but I wonder at the difficulty of balancing as many as this estate must require." "I do not see them often," Duncan answered quietly. "I confess that my management has been more through my land agent than anything. I was uncertain when I first took over ownership of the estate if I would have the strength and presence of mind to shoulder that responsibility. I felt I had only just gotten an understanding of everything when He winced inwardly at the direction the conversation had suddenly taken, and felt the shadow of the skeleton west wing of the building looming close behind. "When my father was no longer there to guide me," he finished lamely. "I do not know that most tenants would wish to see their master's face in this case. I rule better from the shadows." "I cannot imagine that to be true," Isadora interjected frankly but kindly. "Isadora," her father interjected in a scolding tone, "Lord Grant surely understands his estate more than you." Duncan could hear the other implication in his tone, the desire to avoid further talk of his disfigurement. Still, Isadora had brought it up, and Duncan sought to see it through until the end. He looked at her with interest. "Be frank with me, Miss Isadora. Would you so easily trust a master with a face like this?" She waited only a beat before responding, and when she answered him, her eyes were fixed upon his face. "I would sooner trust any face at all than the puppeteer behind a land agent," she answered. She had made no attempt to reason away his disfigurement, nor had she blushed and looked away. She had called Duncan on his bluff, and he found that he respected her for it. As morning stretched into a lazy afternoon, Duncan lost sight of Isadora. Sometime while overlooking a croquet match between the other sisters and exchanging views with Baron Hastings, the middle daughter had slipped quietly away. He thought she did it seamlessly, as though she was well used to taking a back seat in the family. He made some excuse, leaving Daniel with the ladies and the Baron to walk through the maze, and meandered back towards the house. He did not find her on the balcony, and the maid inside said she hadn't seen anyone come into the main house. Duncan walked around the corner, intending to move towards the maze and join the others, when he stumbled upon her in a most unlikely place, leaning against an isolated wall of the manor, knees up, head buried in a little violet book he recognised from his drawing-room table. It was a collection of Shakespearean sonnets. He came and sat down next to her. She noticed too late to stand in respect, and only shifted a little to the side with a blush of embarrassment. He nodded at the book. "Do all young ladies pilfer the books of their host these days?" She relented with a smile. "Only the very fashionable ones, my lord." "Well," he said, "as long as it is only that one, for I have many of those submitted to memory and do not fear the loss of the volume." She looked sheepish and pulled 2 other books into view that had been stowed away on the other side of her skirts. "Actually, I took 3 in case I moved through this one too quickly." He picked up the larger of the 2 and looked at the title. "My, Voltaire. You would not have found this on the side table." He smiled at her with respect. "You found a way to pillage my library as well." She looked as though she was searching for some excuse, but he waved his hand dismissively and turned so that his back was also against the wall, his arm nearly touching hers but not quite, and opened the Voltaire in his own lap. He knew many of the pages by heart, but even so his eyes ran across the words, as if he had never read them before and had no real understanding of the contents. He was too distracted by the scent of the woman beside him, the ease of just being with her, wordless and peaceful, and the breeze of spring stirring around him that for the first time in years seemed to bring a promise of hope. Chapter 9. "You seem lost in thought," Clara said, smiling over at Isadora. The two were sitting at the Beckett tea house, in their favourite little corner with the ferns and a view of the street outside, sipping tea and chatting. Isadora shrugged. "Is that so very unusual for me?" she asked teasingly. "Not in the least," Clara admitted. "But it is unusual for you to smile so when your forehead is usually wrinkled in concentration." Isadora blushed. "I had not realised that I was smiling," she said. In truth, her thoughts had been wholly occupied with the events of a few days prior, when her family had stayed for a weekend at Lord Grant's estate. She found Duncan to be a most singular man, and every day since they'd parted company, her mind had thought of him. He had a gift for guessing her thoughts and anticipating her needs that made her feel truly seen and treasured. She knew that he was more fragile than he appeared. She could see sometimes the depth in his eyes that spoke of a sorrow he did not wish to discuss, and she wished that she could find some way to show him how precious he was. "You were thinking of Lord Grant, were you not?" Clara asked. Her eyes had a gentle look in them. "I know that you had a chance to grow closer with him this last weekend." "I know it is not a conventional friendship," Isadora answered quietly. Conventional or not, she had the frightening feeling that this was just the sort of man she could fall for, scars and all. It was a strange feeling, for she'd never felt it with another person. "I do not think friendship is all that is on that gentleman's mind," Clara said teasingly. She seemed to have overcome her fear of Duncan's scarred visage in the few days they'd spent in each other's company. Isadora seized the opportunity to change the subject. "Do not think that I have noticed your own friendship developing with his gallant friend, my dear. You and Lord Wellington became well enough acquainted these last few days." Clara blushed, and Isadora saw that her words had hit their mark. "We have known Lord Wellington since we were children," she said quickly. "I do not know why anything should be different in our case." "I did not say anything ought to be," Isadora said with a gentle smile. "Only remember that you are no longer children, and it is natural for a young man to notice how a woman has blossomed from youth into beauty." Clara looked as if she was about to protest, when her face suddenly froze, looking over Isadora's shoulder. Before Isadora could turn around to see what was the matter, she saw that Ernest Chapman had slipped into the tea-house without being noticed and was standing at her shoulder. Meeting her gaze, he pulled out a chair at their table without asking and sat down quite near to Isadora. "Miss Hastings," he said with a smile that seemed to distort his handsome face, "I find I am running into you everywhere these days." "Lord Dunmay," she answered quietly, turning her face from him. "I do not think it such an anomaly to cross paths with someone who is clearly initiating the meeting." "You value yourself very highly if you think my only goal is to cross paths with you," he answered in an injured tone. Then suddenly he reached forward and caught her hands up in his own, pressing them tightly. "But I have not forgotten you, Miss Hastings. You cannot ignore me forever." Isadora's cheeks burned. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the tea-house on her. It was an improper thing indeed to seize a woman's hands in such a manner in a public place, particularly when there was no understanding between herself and the gentleman responsible. She jerked her hands back. "I am willing to try," she said coldly, "if it will put some distance between myself and unwanted attentions." His face hardened. "I hear that you have turned from proper society and taken up with that deformed monster living at the Grant estate." She said nothing, not even willing to acknowledge a comment that was so narrow-minded and ignorant. He leaned in, reaching his hand across the table to brush the edge of her sleeve. "I don't appreciate you going about with other men when my intentions have been so clear," he said quietly. "But I especially don't appreciate any connection of mine being seen with the likes of that maimed man. It reflects badly on me." "It is fortunate, then," she responded icily, "that we are not in any way connected. I do not recall asking for your opinion on the state of my own affairs, but even if I had, I would discard any advice that displayed the ignorance and unfeeling nature you have just displayed. Lord Dunmay, Isadora. Clara stood abruptly, indicating the watching room. It was quiet, deadly quiet. Isadora bit off her words as Clara helped her stand. It is time you and I left, don't you think? Isadora blushed with frustration. It was not fair that the pompous Lord Dunmay could come in and insult her so brutally, and yet it was she that was making a scene. She tied on her bonnet, but before she turned to go, Ernest seized her hand again and leaned in close. I am a patient man, he said. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when you will be mine. She pulled her arm away from him and left without looking back. Chapter 10. Duncan pulled up to the manor of Baron Hastings just past tea time. The estate was looking beautiful in the swell of spring, and he smiled at the feminine touch he saw all around. The gardens were brimming with bright colours, the drapes hung in the windows. A swing hung beneath the cherry tree in the front yard. He was let in by the butler, who showed him outside to the official home gardens. They had invited him over for another tea, and this time the elder and younger sisters were there as well. His eyes were, of course, first drawn to the figure of Isadora. She was dressed in a pale yellow gown and had her hair simply attired with a ribbon, and yet she looked to him as though she had sprung herself from the garden, fresh and fragrant. Lord Grant, she said, curtsying, I am so glad that you agreed to visit us again. I was pleased to receive your invitation, he answered. I am sorry that my father is not able to join us today, she said, waving her hand to the rest of the garden as though to emphasize his absence. But I'm afraid he has had some pressing business in town. We are going to ride to the village later and meet him for a walk. Would you care to join us? No, he said quickly. Then, noticing how abrupt such a response seemed to the three sisters, he corrected himself. I mean, I do not think I would make a very good impression in your village. Both Clara and Eliza looked down at their hands, but Isadora kept her gaze on his face and frowned a little. She said nothing directly, but Duncan could see that she was not satisfied with his answer. Desperate to change the subject, he pulled out the gift he had brought her. It was a fine, elegantly bound copy of a book she had mentioned loving. Hamlet, she breathed, looking down at it with delight. I have not a copy myself, and it has been many years since I've had the chance to read this. Heaven knows why you like it so much, Eliza answered wryly. She shrugged at Lord Grant as though apologising for her sister. She has a morose mind that she would so much rather fill it with death and destruction than Shakespeare's finer comedies. Duncan shrugged. Even Shakespeare's comedies often had tragedy, he said, and Hamlet is no passing piece of work. There is no shame in loving it. He saw a smile slip onto Isadora's face as she ran her fingers over the embossed title. I shall read it, she said quietly, and I will return it to you tomorrow. I do not think it possible for you to read it so quickly, he answered her. Take a week if you must, or even a month. Clara laughed brightly. I have seen Isadora read far longer works in less time. If she says she can finish it by tomorrow, then she speaks true. Besides, I wouldn't doubt that she has much of it committed to memory. And yet you have no copy yourself? He asked wonderingly. Isadora blushed. When I last held a copy, I wrote down portions of it that particularly pleased me. I cannot thank you enough for giving me another chance to read it in its entirety. Suddenly, an almost impish look came into her eye. The reason I love this play has nothing at all to do with the death and destruction in it, by the way. I am drawn to the contrast between appearance and reality in the pages. Is that so? He asked, not understanding. Yes. She smiled and quoted without even opening the book. One may smile and be a villain, for example, or later, when he calls all that makes man appear fine to be but a quintessence of dust. Hamlet does not put much face in outer finery, especially when it hides a darkened soul. He would much prefer, I think, the pure heart that did not rely on an elegant exterior. Duncan realised what she was saying, although he could see that her sisters were not quite comprehending. He looked at her with a note of warning in his voice. Perhaps, but Hamlet himself understood that though distressing, outward appearances do matter. That is why even the trappings and the suits of woe are necessary at times to fit into society. She did not argue with this, but she met his gaze steadily and asked again what she had asked before. "Will you not go walking with us in town to see my father, Lord Grant? I would be grateful for your company." He was disarmed by her lovely eyes and her Shakespearean trickery, and he realised with a start that she was not going to allow him to continue hiding under the guise that his face was an affront to society. She was challenging him to be brave and accompany her into the light of day, and as alarming as the idea was, he found himself drawn to her all the more for having thought of it. Chapter 11. The three sisters rode with Duncan in his carriage to the village, and then climbed out in a rush of silk and laughter. Clara and Eliza walked ahead, giggling to each other and peering into shop windows, whilst Isadora stayed behind with Duncan at her side. She could feel his marked discomfort, saw the way he turned his face away from everyone they passed to hide his deformity. Her heart went out to him, but she kept walking at his side as though she did not notice. "I thank you for the book," she said, hoping conversation would help to distract him. "I have always loved Shakespeare. One of my favourite things about him is the way that, no matter what stage of life you're in, he has something worth saying about it. Sometimes I am touched by The Tempest, sometimes by Much Ado. And yet even then you always return again and again to your favourites," he said quietly. She looked up at him and saw that for the moment he wasn't looking around at the curious passers-by. His eyes were only on her face, and there was an intensity in them that disarmed her. "You thank me for my gift," he said, "and yet I have been remiss in thanking you for yours." "I do not know what you mean," she said a little breathlessly. "The potion that you gave me," he answered her. "It has worked wonders in softening the skin and lessening my pain." She laughed despite herself, charmed by his serious manner. "I do not think that I would call it a potion. We are not living in a fairy tale with witches and warlocks, my lord." "Then what would you call it?" he asked, his own eyes twinkling in response to her mirth. "Perhaps a balm," she said with a shrug. "Ah," he answered. "That is just right." He looked away from her with a smile, but she saw his expression tighten when a group of women gasped audibly as he passed. He looked back at her with a look of pain deep in his eyes. "There is no balm for that, I imagine." "There is," she answered. She reached out and took his arm, not caring that this gesture might cause even more reason for gossip than the scarred face of the man whose arm she was holding. "I have heard that, when faced with the ignorance of other people, the truest balm is to turn to those you respect and care for, and rejoice in them, rather than focusing on the failings of others." He looked at her as though he did not fully understand her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth again. "You are a very wise woman," he said slowly. "Thank you," she answered with a teasing smile. He looked as though he was going to turn back to the people standing along the boardwalk, so she tugged at his arm to hold his attention. "But that is not sufficient for the balm I described. You must make an attempt to learn more about me, and to be properly delighted with all you find." The half-smile on his face widened considerably. "So, I know your two passions, books and medicine, but you have not told me your dislikes yet, and I find those equally important to knowing the measure of a person." "Quite right," she responded. "I have never cared for apples, actually." "No," he interrupted with a laugh. "You shall not escape this query with the sort of light-hearted answers that tell me nothing at all about you. I require something of real purpose." She tilted her head up and looked at him. "Then I shall tell you I dislike people who think highly of themselves at the expense of others. I know one such man, and he has caused harm in all his relationships." She frowned, thinking of Ernest. "And I also do not care for those who are wealthy and choose to hoard all that has been given them, rather than helping others." She nudged him with a smile. You have passed on both counts, luckily for yourself. Indeed. He pretended a sigh of relief. But, she said with mock severity, I also don't care for people who think the matter of apples is a light-hearted issue, and therefore you have at least one black mark against your character. He threw back his head at that and laughed. The sound filled her with warmth and happiness, and seemed to drive the shadow from them at last. Chapter 12. She was the most delightful person he had ever met. As they walked, Duncan felt the hot shame that had flooded him at the thought of showing his maimed face in town slowly ease away. It was hard to think about the things he lacked when the gift he'd been given, the presence of a lady so lovely and so kind, was near at hand. They came to the courtyard at the centre of the village, and he saw the Baron striding towards them with a smile on his face. "Is your business quite finished, Father?" Eliza asked. "We had not quite made it to the millinery yet." He smiled, looking at Duncan in mild surprise. "I have tended to the accounts, and things are quite in hand. I am surprised to see you here, Lord Grant. I'm sorry that I could not make our tea as planned." "This is quite pleasant," Duncan said reassuringly. "I find that a walk through the village was exactly what was needed." Clara came and slipped her arm through Isadora's free one. "Please," she pleaded, "might we go by the milliner before we continue?" She blinked her lashes at her older sister. "You must come with me to find the yellow ribbon that will match my day gown." Isadora looked at Duncan, and it warmed him to see that her desire was clearly to remain with him, her arm resting in his. But in the end her sister's heart gave in and she agreed, pulling away from Duncan and curtsying. "We will be back quite soon," she assured Duncan and her father, hurrying away with the sister on both arms. When she'd gone, Baron Hastings looked at Duncan with a curious expression on his face. "You seem quite at home with my family," he said slowly, not speaking directly, and yet Duncan knew exactly what he was implying. Whether it was because of the question in the Baron's eyes, or because of the absence now felt when Isadora withdrew her arm from his, Duncan felt a sudden urge to speak freely with the man. He cleared his throat. "Is there a place nearby where we might wait for your daughters to return? A place of some privacy?" Duncan asked. A brief smile came into the Baron's face. "There is a garden just yonder, attached to the bookshop." The two men walked together to the garden and sat under the shade of a spreading willow on one of the low benches there. Duncan felt his courage failing within him, and yet he pressed on. "Baron Hastings, I can hardly bring myself to broach the subject at hand, knowing as I do the worth of the thing I am going to request, but I would regret it all my days if I did not at least lay my question at your feet." Lord Hastings nodded. "Continue." Duncan held back a smile. The man was not going to relent and help him out of the conversation by giving hints and acknowledgements along the way. He respected that. "I would like to speak with you about your daughter." He paused, knowing that it was more common to address courtship to the eldest daughter, and that he was bucking tradition. "Miss Isadora Hastings." "I imagined as much," the older man said. "I find her companionship to be a gift I did not even know that I needed," Duncan went on, his heart warming to the subject as he spoke. "I will be honest with you, as a man ought to be honest in such matters, and tell you that, because of my situation, my visage and my history, I had not hoped to pursue courtship of any sort again. And yet Isadora is the sort of woman that gives a man reason to hope. I would like to humbly ask your permission to court her." The Baron nodded and looked down at his hands for a long moment in silence. Then he raised his head and smiled at Duncan. "Have you some knowledge of her returning your respect and affection?" he asked. Duncan sighed. "I know that she is not wholly averse to my company, but I have not pressed my suit with her yet. I will of course speak with her directly, but I would appreciate your blessing before I do so." The other man laughed a little sadly. "Isadora is the most like her mother," he said quietly. "Though I have always known her beauty and wit would eventually draw her from my own home into the home of another, I have dreaded this day. I did not think I would ever find a man worthy of her." He paused and looked Duncan directly in the eye. "In you, Lord Grant, I have been proved wrong. I believe that you would care for my daughter all her days. I believe that you love her, even if you have not admitted as much to yourself, and I believe that my daughter would be happy with you." He shrugged. "You will, of course, have to ask her, but I will encourage you with this. My Isadora has never held the arm of a young man before, and here I find her walking through town with you today, looking as though she has always been there upon your arm." Duncan's heart swelled with hope. He had not set out that day to ask permission to court Isadora. He would have imagined it to be a scandalous assumption, to think that a woman so beautiful and so accomplished would be willing to tie herself to his company and reputation. But her kindness had moved his heart to action, and now he found himself looking at the possibility of a future with her. He felt as though the bonds about his heart were dropping off, one by one. The two gentlemen kept talking, and Duncan felt an easy camaraderie with the older man. There had always been respect, but now that this great truth had been shared between them, there was friendship. When the sisters returned after their shopping, the Baron deftly manoeuvred Clara and Eliza into his own carriage, allowing Duncan some privacy with Isadora on the ride home. She chatted lightly as they went, talking about the people they had seen and the passing countryside. But when they edged over the hill and were nearly upon the manor, Duncan called for the coach to be pulled aside beneath a spreading tree. "Why are we stopping?" Isadora asked innocently. "I was wondering," he answered, his heart in his throat, "whether or not you might step out of the carriage with me for a moment. I have something I wish to discuss with you in privacy." She looked confused, but climbed out easily with his assistance. They walked to the tree, not because Duncan found it necessary, but because he needed a moment to gather his thoughts. When they arrived, she raised her face up to look at him, her eyes wide and expectant. "I was wondering, Miss Hastings," he asked quietly, "if you might be induced to enter into a courtship with me. I have been most moved by your beauty and character, and would be honoured to enter into an understanding about our future together." He watched her face carefully, waiting for the flush of astonishment, alarm, pity, or confusion. Instead, he saw only a gentle smile climb from her lips into her bright eyes. "Lord Grant," she said softly, "I would be honoured indeed." She stretched out her hand to him, and he took it, thankful, and kissed it. Chapter 13. Lord Wellington arrived at the Hastings Manor a few days after the official courtship began between Isadora and Duncan, intent on asking the youngest Hastings daughter for a walk in the fresh spring air. The Baron pulled Isadora aside and bid her accompany them as a chaperone. "But do not allow them to grow too fond of one another," he added a little sadly. "I would not be able to part with two of my treasures so quickly, one upon the heels of the other." "You do not have to part with either of us at present," Isadora assured him, but she smiled to see that despite his protestations, her father was pleased to have two such honourable suitors in pursuit of his daughter's affections. He seemed to have forgotten all about the rude propositions of Lord Dunmay, and though Isadora could not quite drive the memory of Ernest's threats from her own mind, she was happy enough to see her father free of them. She had much to occupy her own thoughts, besides. Duncan had been all tenderness since the beginning of their courtship, and Isadora was filled with excitement about their future. She had admitted to Clara the night before that she cared deeply about the venerable Lord Grant, that he was loving and affectionate to her, though he seemed so removed and careful with others, and that she yearned to be around him when they were separated. What she had not said aloud, although she knew it to be true in her own heart, was that she didn't just care for him, she loved him, and it was a deeper love than she had ever known. She agreed to walk out with Clara and Lord Wellington, but stayed a few steps behind them to afford them the alone time that she knew she would want in their same situation. Clara seemed enamoured with the handsome young man at her side, and he with her. After all that they'd been through in the Hastings household, poverty and loss and worry, it was a relief to feel at last that things were turning for the better. Clara was smiling. Isadora's heart was singing, and Eliza was, for the moment, not the only one responsible for marrying well and rescuing the family name. Near the end of the walk, Lord Wellington seemed at last able to tear his eyes from his beautiful companion. He turned and inquired of Isadora how her courtship was thus far with his friend. "I confess I was startled when he first told me of the arrangement," the young man said with a smile. "I will admit that I had hopes in that direction already, but you must understand that my dear friend is not a very open man. I hardly dared to hope that he would be able to lay aside his careful manners and ask for more time with a lady such as yourself." Isadora came to walk closer to the pair in front of her, smiling. "A lady such as myself could not but be flattered by the attentions of such a man," she said simply. Lord Wellington cocked his head to the side and looked her over with a searching gaze. "Tell me," he said, "what is it that first drew you to my friend?" Isadora wondered if he was testing her to see if her motives were really for Duncan's good, or if she was only willing to weather his difficult past for a chance at his grand fortune. She met the young man's gaze, her own face steady. "He is an honourable man," she said quietly. "I have the unique position of knowing how rare an honourable man is, and I enjoy his company more than that of any other person I have ever met." Clara gave a giggle. "Sister, I am standing right here. Surely you do not enjoy his company more than mine." Isadora laughed with Clara, and they walked on together. But in her heart, Isadora knew that what Clara had said was not true. Duncan had surmounted all others in her heart. It was exciting, and it was terrifying as well. Chapter 14. "Is everything quite prepared for the evening meal?" Duncan asked, hurrying into the dining room and looking at the spread. His butler stepped to the side and smiled indulgently. "Quite, my lord. I did everything just as you requested. The cook says that it is the most elaborate thing undertaken in years." Duncan smiled. "I would wish it so." He turned and looked at the servant with excitement building in his heart. "I am glad that we are having the Hastings family to our abode again. They bring a certain life and laughter here that we are sorely lacking." "Indeed." Georges bowed and smiled. "I find Miss Isadora Hastings particularly engaging." The staff had been delighted to hear of the courtship, and though they were bound by societal laws of propriety and had not spoken to him directly on the subject, he could see from their eager eyes and teasing turns of phrase that they were pleased at the prospect of a new mistress in the home. Georges paused, polishing an invisible speck that he seemed to see on one of the glasses. He kept his eyes on his work as he spoke. "Do you not think," he ventured, clearing his throat, "that it might be beneficial to begin construction on the west wing of the manor, my lord? I know that we have kept it as is for the last few years, but I do not think your parents would have demanded such loyalty from you in the face of a marriage to a fine lady." "You have overstepped, George," Duncan said sharply, anger flooding him at the thought. His courtship with Isadora had been a beautiful thing, certainly, and during the day he was sometimes able to forget the pain in his scarred face or the smell of charcoal that crept into his dreams at night. But he only ever felt guilty when he remembered the tragedy again. "I will not be doing construction of any sort. You know better than to speak on such matters with me. I only thought that the lady might—" "The lady and I are not married yet, George," Duncan snapped, turning from the table. "I will not have you destroying my parents' memory at the very idea of a new mistress." He turned and stalked from the room, his heart beating quickly. He had not thought about the West Wing with relation to Isadora. It was difficult to hold the thought of her beauty and purity in his mind at the same time as the thought of that charred edifice. Now that he was forced to imagine what she would think of a life chained to his tragedy, it made him ill with confusion. He was in that very state, pacing in his room, until he heard the carriage pull up outside and the measured tones of George welcoming guests. He straightened his cravat and walked downstairs. No sooner had he come into sight of Isadora, but the dark thoughts were driven back out of the forefront again. She was standing in a royal blue gown that trailed lightly on the floor, her arms bare in the shining light, her hair curling softly around her face. Her family came and greeted him, but she waited until he walked to her before slipping her soft hand into his elbow and looking up at him with a gentle frown. "Is all well?" she asked quietly, so that only he could hear. "You seem troubled." He was both touched and frightened that she could read him so clearly. He forced a smile. "All will not be well until you follow me into the garden. I have something most pressing to show you." The rest of the family went with George into the parlour, but Duncan and Isadora walked outside to where long rows of herbs were planted neatly beneath one of the far windows. Isadora gasped with delight when she saw it, at once releasing Duncan's arm and hurrying over, silk gown and all, to bend down over the plants. "This is new," she exclaimed. "You have planted an herb garden. Look, echinacea. You will not believe what I can do with that if you allow me to steep it in water and make a tea. It is very wholesome, as much as, yes, I see your basil, although it is early in the year to plant such an herb. Do not worry, we will move it out into the sunlight later, and it will help ease worries and aches if mixed with mint and lemon." She rambled on in delight, lifting and caressing a leaf here or a stem here, telling Duncan the names of all the things he had in his garden, and adding their medicinal properties when applicable. He stood frozen, watching her as one might watch a rare bird that alit suddenly on a nearby branch. He felt as though he only had a few minutes to soak up all the beauty that was before him, and he stood transfixed before it. He felt her light and laughter healing him, restoring him from all the hard thoughts he'd had in connection with George's comments. "What are you smiling at?" she asked at last, pausing with a bundle of fragrant leaves in her fingers. He shook himself. "You, of course." She cocked her head to the side and smiled gently back at him. "What about me?" He took a few steps towards her in the waning light. "You are a beautiful thing to observe, and your heart brings mine great delight." A pink blush tinged her cheeks. "You are kind." "I am fortunate, actually," he corrected her. He wanted to take her in his arms then and there and tell her how he had fallen for her, despite his efforts to stay far away from matters of the heart. Still, she was nothing like the woman who had broken his heart. She couldn't be. He told himself that he could trust her, that she was a safe place. If she wasn't, he knew that it would shatter him forever, for her hold on him was growing too strong to shake. Chapter 15. After dinner, the company moved from the dining room into the main parlour to play a round of games. They began with charades, which Eliza disapproved heartily of, and then went on to various word games that kept the company on their toes. Lord Wellington had arrived later in the evening, and at once took up a position at Clara's side, hanging on her every word. Isadora watched all this with delight, and as the evening drew on, stood and slipped away to the library for a few minutes of quiet. She wanted to return the Hamlet that had been so kindly given her, but more than that she meant to search the shelves for new treasures. She knew from her conversations with Duncan that he would approve of such a thing. He seemed to understand her ravenous hunger for the written word, and to want to feed it in any way he could. The library was dark, and she had to fumble around a bit to find a light. There was a lantern atop the mantelpiece, and she lit it after the second try, fumbling for the matches. She slipped Hamlet back into place alongside the Shakespeare collection, and then walked quietly along the shelves, scanning titles. Duncan had a remarkable poetry collection, with names that she didn't even recognise. She set the lantern down and opened one thin volume, flipping through it and reading morsels of phrases that made her think of faraway lands and piracy on the high seas. She sighed with delight and put the book back. Just then a breeze came and tugged at the lantern light. If the light had been a candle, unprotected by glass, it would have blown out. As it was, it only made Isadora look up in the direction of the dark, vacant door. She froze and felt the breeze again. She remembered the first time she had ever come to the mansion, when she had been so frightened by the west side, burnt and skeleton-like, and she felt a chill. Just as soon she shook her head and took hold of the lantern, stepping towards the darkness. She no longer had anything to be afraid of after all. She was courting the mysterious Lord Grant and had found him to be only a kind man with a sad history, nothing more terrifying than that. She was curious about the breeze and the darkness, and tonight she would face the fear that crawled up her spine at the thought of it all. She tightened her hand across the handle of the lantern and stepped out into the hall beyond. A few steps down the corridor, she smelled it for the first time. Charcoal. It was a faint smell, but the more she walked along, the sharper and more bitter it became. She thought about turning back, but something drove her on. She came to the end of the hall and saw there a charred staircase. It was a smaller, though no less elegant version of the great staircase at the front door, only this one was in disrepair. Black streaks licked along the base of the banister, and paint was curling away from the decorative edging. For a sickening moment, Isadora could almost imagine the flames licking along the steps and up towards the chambers above. She hesitated only a moment, steeled her teeth, and then began climbing the staircase. Upstairs, the blackening increased. There was a connecting hallway to the rest of the house over which hung a thick tapestry, but she didn't turn back towards civilization. Instead, she pushed into the west wing, feeling as though she was unravelling the secret pain that still lurked behind Duncan's eyes. She wanted to know every part of him, even this terrifying darkness he hid. She felt the change before she saw it, the rough ground, the uneven surface, the crack of grass beneath her slippers. She froze and raised the lantern, looking around. The room she was in was clearly a former bedroom of sorts. There was a solar-attached large window and a fireplace. It was an eerie place, however, strewn with broken glass and ash. The window frames were dark, and the breeze had intensified. She realised that the rooms onwards must comprise the skeletal frame of the western wing, the part that was completely unlivable. But the place where she stood was livable. She knew that because there was a bed in the centre of the room, freshly made with plain, clean sheets. There was a table and a copy of The Tempest on it beside a single candle. She felt a shiver and stepped back, suddenly realising how far she had intruded into the secret place of the man she loved. The realisation came too late, for she heard behind her a quiet, low voice. "What are you doing?" It was a statement, not a question. She turned and saw Duncan standing in the doorway. His words were cold, his tone even more so. His hands hung limply at his side, and she thought all in a moment that he looked like a broken child. "Lord Grant, What do you think you're doing?" "Ice." He stepped forward into the room, and she saw the lantern light reflected like flames in his eyes. She stepped backwards. "I felt a breeze. I went to investigate, and I found myself here." She swallowed hard, feeling how empty her words sounded in this tomb of a room. She stepped forward again, tentatively. "Please," she entreated gently. "Tell me, are you sleeping here? I saw the book and wondered." He shook his head. "You should not have come here," he snapped. "You have no right." "I see that now," she said, tears starting into her eyes. "Do you know what this is?" he asked harshly, stepping towards her again. He waved his hand around the room. "You're so curious, aren't you? This is a wound, like this." He gestured sharply at his face where the scar ravaged his cheek. "And you stepped into that wound where you weren't invited." The tears began to fall. Isadora shook her head. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "You're right, you didn't know." His jaw worked in quiet fury. "You can't know, nobody can, because nobody has lived through what I lived through." He pointed towards the door. "Get out." She stood in dumb shock. This behaviour was completely out of the ordinary and out of character for the man she had grown to know and love. She shook her head. "You don't mean that. Please, Duncan." "Do not use my name," he said quietly, his voice like the death all around him. "Get out now." She sniffed back the tears that were running down her cheeks. She could see that entreaties were useless, but something in her wanted to hang on to the moment, as awful as it was, because she had a horrible feeling if she left him now, she would never be allowed back into his heart. She looked down and saw the glass scattered around at her feet, broken, too broken to ever be restored. "Now," he said again, his eyes turned away from her towards the corner of the room, as though somewhere amongst the charred edges he found an escape. She turned, wordless, and left him there with his ghosts. Chapter 16. He couldn't sleep that night. The party had been over after that, of course. Georges showed the people out, and Duncan left it to his friend and the butler to explain to the confused Hastings family what had gone wrong so very quickly. He knew Isadora would say nothing about what happened. She was not the sort to expose him. He sat up in bed, the Tempest open but unread on his lap, looking at the candle as though it would offer him some sort of answer. He felt miserable about what had passed between him and the only beautiful thing he had ever known. He had watched himself speak harshly to her as though from a great distance, not really knowing what it was about the West Wing that brought out this hard side of himself. He lay down and tried to sleep, but always at the front of his mind was the memory of her face, confused and streaked with tears. He wanted to reach out to her and comfort her. He wished he had, but now she was gone. In the morning he rose with the light and gave up sleep at last, walking downstairs. In the parlour, a figure moved on the settee. "Daniel?" he asked quietly. His friend sat up, stretching uncomfortably. "Did you sleep here last night?" Duncan asked. The other man gave a sigh and shrugged. "Of course I did. Are you ready to talk, my friend?" Duncan walked past him, putting a hand to his head. "I don't know what I have to say. What do you know?"
Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
"I know you sent them home early last night, which, since you know my feelings for Clara Hastings, can only have been a confusion between you and Miss Isadora. Otherwise you would not have jeopardized my own romance," he teased. Duncan shot him a look, and Daniel sobered. "I can see that I've overstepped," he said quietly. "Tell me what happened, Duncan." "I found her in the West Wing. She said that she was following a breezy, that she was curious. I was unkind to her and sent her away." Duncan looked down at his hands. "I know that you will think harshly of me, but that is not just a room to me. It is a memory and a thought that I did not invite her into yet. She had no right." Daniel sat quietly for a long moment, and when he spoke there was a wealth of tenderness in his voice. "I know it is not just any room, my friend. She knows it too. But I believe that the woman you are courting does indeed have a right to those hidden, frightening places of your past. You should not be asking why she would venture there, but you should be asking why you did not take her there yourself." Duncan turned to protest, but even as he did so he knew that his friend was right. Isadora deserved to know all about that terrible night. She deserved to know about the weight of guilt he felt and the terror that kept him up at night. He sank down on a settee and dropped his head into his hands. "It is not a burden that is hers to carry," he said quietly. "It is mine to suffer alone. Can you imagine me marrying her and asking her to go with me to that burned-out room every night?" Daniel came and put a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said wryly. "I cannot endorse you bringing a bride to that chamber, but that is a symptom of the problem we can argue about at another time. You say that the burden is yours alone, and I will disagree with you again. Perhaps it is too much for her to bear, but you do her a disservice by denying her the opportunity to try. I have known that family for some time, and I can tell you that Isadora has seen her own share of brokenness and loss. Let her into your secret pain, and she will feel free to let you into hers." Duncan sighed. "This advice is a little late," he said dryly. "I have already alienated her. You should have seen her face, Daniel. She was crushed. I can only imagine. I I can't stop imagining it now that I have seen it, Duncan said, his voice hoarse. And I can tell you that any chance I once had with that woman has long since departed. She will not have me, now that she has seen the beast within. I remember a time when you told me she would not have you when she saw the beast without, Daniel said with a brief laugh. And you were wrong about that. Write to her. Apologize. Tell her that you were wrong, and that you miss her and wish to connect with her again. Duncan looked at his friend. It seems too much to ask. Daniel smiled. I have never been married, but I have heard that it is a lifetime of failing and forgiving. You might as well practice it now. Duncan stood, his heart beating quickly. He went to the nearby desk and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. Daniel had not given him a solution, but he had handed him back a sliver of hope, and that was enough. Chapter 17. I still don't understand, the Baron said, looking up from his morning paper at the breakfast table, his eyes on his daughter's face. Did you receive an explanation yet of Lord Grant's behaviour? Was there a difficult business matter that came up, or was he ill? I simply cannot imagine a man so careful and cultured that might abandon his guests so quickly. Isadora bit her lip and fixed her eyes on the cup of tea before her. I don't know, Father. He has written me no explanation, and I do not ask for one. Surely you have some idea, Eliza interjected. Weren't you two talking before he sent us all away? We assumed when you both disappeared from the parlour that you were engaging in some manner of romantic chatter. Clara alone seemed to see Isadora's discomfort. She reached over and took hold of her sister's wrist gently. Would you like to read to us, Isadora? It might bring us all some peace. Isadora took a sip of tea, but could barely swallow for the lump in her throat. I do not think I can read today, she said softly. Her father looked up suddenly. Is something the matter, Isadora? It is unlike you to give up the chance to read. The butler appeared at that moment, saving Isadora. A letter for Miss Isadora Hastings, he said, producing a letter. Isadora looked up with a start, her heart beating with hope. There you are, Clara said with a smile. I knew that he must write to explain himself. The butler came and laid a silver tray with a small white letter on it before Isadora. She picked it up and turned it over expectantly, only to see Ernest's name inscribed on the return instead of Duncan's. Her heart sank and she stood miserably. I'm sorry, she said, leaving the letter on the table. I know we are planning on going to town later. I'm going to change now and I will meet you outside by the carriage. I find I'm not feeling up to reading any correspondence at present. She fled the room, knowing full well that her father and sisters would read the return on the message and worry about her, knowing that they would talk about how out of character this emotion was. Still, she could not find it in herself to return and assuage their fears. The truth was, they were right to worry. She felt as though her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces, like the glass on Duncan's floor, and she couldn't seem to anchor herself to weather the storm. She just kept seeing the anger and betrayal on his face. She didn't understand why he wouldn't let her step into his life. He was content to let her heal his external wounds, but he reserved the right to suffer and fester his internal wounds in silence. She wanted to feel angry at him for his treatment of her, but even at her most justified she knew that she shouldn't have gone into the West Wing without asking him. She was miserable. She knew he was hurting, and she could do nothing to stop his hurt because she had been the one to cause it. More than that, she missed him. She tried to bring back the memories of his tenderness and affection, but she could only see the anger in his eyes and the way he had looked at her without feeling or sentiment. He had the expression of a broken man, and she wondered for the first time if his heart was like that blackened room, empty and cold and fixated on preserving the past. There had been no place in that room for her. Was she foolish to have thought there would be a place in his heart either? She dressed for town with numb fingers. She didn't want to go, not when it would be another place that reminded her of Duncan, and yet she felt guilty for her show of emotion earlier and saw this as the only way to reassure her sisters. She tied on her bonnet and walked downstairs with a heavy heart. She heard Clara and Eliza outside already, waiting for her. She walked outside and looked away from their questioning gazes. "We can go another day," Clara said quietly, apologetically. Isadora forced a smile. "Of course not. I was just feeling indisposed earlier. I'm quite recovered now," she said quickly. She turned and looked at the carriage. "That is not our carriage. Did you rent one from town?" "I believe Father has business nearby and wished us to take another carriage so he might have a ride," Eliza said primly. "Unless, of course, you think he ought to lay aside his business for us." Isadora shook her head. "Of course not." She led the way to the carriage and opened the door. Everything happened quite suddenly after that. An arm shot out from inside the carriage, clothed in black, and a masked man dragged her inside so quickly that she fell across the bottom of the carriage with a scream. The door slammed shut behind her. She scrambled up, desperate to understand and escape, but could already feel the carriage leaping forward even as she heard the screams of her sisters fading behind. She turned, terrified, and saw her captor pull aside his mask with a cruel smile curling his lips. "I told you," Ernest said coldly, "you would be mine one day." Chapter 18. Duncan was out the door the moment Daniel told him the news. He went for the stables at once, his friend close on his heels. "Wait," Daniel protested. "There is nothing that you can do, I assure you. Let us think with level heads." "Level heads?" Duncan whirled on him. "You have just told me that the woman I love, the woman I injured horribly only a few days ago, has been kidnapped. I cannot be level-headed in the face of such horror. I will ride at once to her family's side." Daniel protested no further, but was waiting when Duncan reappeared. They rode on horseback together to the Baron's manor, where they found he had already left to inform the constable of the situation. A search had been launched across the countryside. Clara and Eliza were in the main drawing room. Eliza was crying desperately, Clara sitting pale and drawn at her sister's side. "Please," Duncan asked brokenly, "tell me what happened in full." "We were going to go to the village," Eliza answered through her tears. "We thought Father had ordered the carriage, for it was not one that we recognised, but when Isadora went to climb in, she was snatched from within." Clara spoke, her voice strained and weak. "She looked so helpless," she said softly, "and she screamed in fear." "Did you see who took her?" Duncan asked. "Surely you recognise something." "Do not attack them," Daniel interjected. "They endured a traumatic experience and are doubtless recovering." "No," Clara interjected, turning to Duncan with tears in her eyes. "No, he is right to ask. We were the last ones to see her, and perhaps if we remember something rightly about her kidnapping, we might be able to find her attacker." Duncan's heart melted at the sight of her misery. He stood and came to her side, bending down on one knee and taking her hands in his. "You are not at fault, Miss Clara. Neither of you are, and neither of you are responsible to remember something that no person should be forced to endure. Tell me what happened, and I will frighten you no longer." She nodded, sniffing back her tears. "I do not know how long the carriage was there, but it was not a familiar one. We are well acquainted with the county, but I have not seen a rig so plain or so black before. I think it might have been rented from a nearby city." "That is good thinking, Miss Clara," Duncan said, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was pounding out of control. In truth, he had not felt this kind of fear since the night of the fire. The helpless terror was upon him again. He thought of Isadora's broken face and wondered desperately if the last words he would ever speak to her would be the cruel "get out" he'd thrown her way after the incident in the West Wing. He stood, looking at Daniel. "I am going now to join the search party," he said. "I will find your father and offer him my services. Daniel, will you stay with these two young ladies that they might have your assistance and comfort? I would not want them to fear anything after this startling occurrence." Daniel nodded, his face grateful. Clara stood and turned her face to peer up at Duncan. "Please," she said, "please find her. She was so sad this morning, so distressed over some matter or other, and I never see her like that. I wonder if this kidnapping might be somehow associated with that sadness." Duncan felt another stab of guilt. He shook his head. "I do not know that her sadness was connected with this," he said softly. "But whatever the cause, I can tell you that I will not rest until she is safely returned to you." He was about to climb onto his horse again when Eliza called to him from the house. "Wait," she said, holding up something small and white. "What is it?" he asked, coming back to her side. Clara appeared behind her in the doorway and nodded to the letter. "This morning," she said quietly, "she received this letter in the post. She seemed upset and refused to read it, but you did ask for anything we might remember." Duncan picked the letter up and turned it over, frowning. He looked up at the sisters in alarm. "Who is this Lord Dunmay?" he asked, "and what business does he have with Isadora?" Chapter 19. The carriage ride lasted less than an hour, but Isadora tried to escape twice. The first time, despite the speed of the carriage, she attempted to lunge out the door. Ernest blocked her way, laughing. The second time, she attempted to distract him by striking at him suddenly from one side, but he was far stronger than her, and easily wrestled her back into the seat opposite him. When they reached their destination at last, she was surprised to see that it was not the Dunmay estate at all, but a smaller cottage nestled in a backwoods area with which she was unfamiliar. He climbed out and, taking her by the elbow, pulled her after him. "Listen," he said in a low tone when they were left alone at last in the front hall. "The staff here is loyal to me, and so I would not attempt to gain their sympathy if I were you." He led her down a long hallway to a room that was dark and thickly hung with tapestry. "These will be your chambers," he said coldly. "Go inside and change into the gown you find there. Afterwards we will have dinner together." She felt a shiver run up her spine at his words and set her jaw against him. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "People do not refuse me," he answered her coldly, "at least not twice." He turned to go and then paused. "However, if you need extra motivation, I will tell you that a certain bit of information about your father's failing finances came to me recently. If you do not go along with the task at hand, I will find a way to ruin him more, permanently." Isadora shook her head. "You would not." "I have more power than you know," he hissed. Left alone, Isadora walked, shivering, into the room. There was a large bed thickly covered in blankets, and upon it a golden gown trimmed with gaudy lace and pearls. She stared at it for a long time and then, shaking with fear for her family, slipped into it. It frightened her how well it fit. She pinned her hair up with trembling fingers and waited until a maid appeared at the door to take her to dinner. The maid kept her eyes on the ground and would not answer any of Isadora's questions about her whereabouts. It appeared that Ernest's information about the loyalty of the staff held true. Dinner was an elaborate affair, set up in an equally dark and heavy room where the curtains were drawn and the only light came from an array of candles in the centre of the table. Isadora was seated, nervous and silent, beside Ernest, who dug into the duck before him with a capacious appetite. Isadora could not eat a bite. She sat, watching her host, waiting for him to give her his terms. At last he leaned back in his chair and picked up the glass of after-dinner sherry. His eyes were shadowed. "You're not eating." His voice was sharp. "I'm not exactly hungry," Isadora answered coldly. "You can force me to join you for dinner, but you cannot force me to forget that I am held here by force." He took a sip of his drink. "I am surprised at your hostility, Miss Hastings. I would have thought that, considering the circumstances, you would have been overwhelmingly grateful to be rescued from that monster you are rumoured to have an attachment with." Isadora shivered. "Are you speaking of Lord Grant?" He waved one hand languidly. "Unless there is some other deformed man you're currently courting." "He is not a monster," she said quietly. "He is, in fact, the kindest man that I have ever met." "He would have to be," Ernest quipped, laughing lightly at his own joke. I would imagine that an amiable character is the only positive quality left to a man like him. Isadora shook her head in strained astonishment. I do not understand, she said, how a man like yourself, who appears to have his wits about him, could imagine that kidnapping me and threatening me could ever result in a happy union. That is what you intend, is it not? To marry me. I intend to have you as my own, yes, Ernest said with a slow smile. It is precisely because of my wits that I am able to see through this subterfuge that you have called protest. I can see that your thoughts are on me, even if your words are not. I know how women respond to me, and I know that you have been settling for the beast at Grant Manor, when you could have all the wealth and beauty in England at your disposal. He is not a beast. She felt herself begin to shake with anger. And I am not settling. You are narrow-minded, Lord Dunmay, and therefore you cannot fathom being attracted to somebody who has a scar on their face or a turbulent history. You want things beautiful and easy. I tell you, however, that Lord Grant is not just a kind man. He's not just wealthy or accomplished or well-read. He is also quite handsome. You may roll your eyes as you wish. I believe that it only shows your ignorance and blindness. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. Please, she said softly, take me back to him. I love him. If she had imagined for a moment that honesty would melt the heart of her captor, she was sorely mistaken. Instead, it seemed to bring fresh storm clouds to his smooth demeanour. His eyes narrowed, and he frowned at her with a nasty sneer. You are actually attracted to that lump of flesh, he snapped. You have been deceived, I imagine. I have not. She stood quickly, pushing back her chair from the table. I know my own mind, and I would be a lucky woman to find myself forever in the company of that fine gentleman. Her heart sank within her, and she added softly, if he will still have me, of course. Ernest stood as well, taking a menacing step forward. You are out of your mind, he said in a tone that was so quiet she almost could not hear it. You are driven mad by hysteria and do not know your own heart. I cannot believe that you really love that man, and I cannot believe that you would choose such a disgusting specimen over someone like myself. No, we shall continue on with my plan. We shall go to Ireland and be married there, and live quite happily together. Isadora felt a sense of panic rolling over her. She took hold of the back of her chair to steady herself. No, she said, you will not force me to do such a thing. I know what is best for you, he said, coming forward and laying a cold hand over hers. Even if, for the moment, you are too blinded to know what is best for yourself. She pulled her hand away, looking desperately towards the door, but there was no one there to rescue her. I would like to retire now, she said in a hoarse voice. I am worn out after all that has happened today, and I would not like to discuss this matter any further. There was a madness in his eyes that she didn't trust. She feared for a moment that he would cause her harm, but he seemed to believe his own tale of chivalry and affection enough to keep up the pretence of respect. He stepped back and bowed obsequiously. Of course, my lady. I'm sure that you will feel differently in the morning. She wanted to retort, but that warning look was still in his eyes. Instead, she pressed her lips tightly together, bowed her head, and slipped back to her bedroom. She heard a key turn in the lock when she was inside and sank down onto the bed, head in her hands. Isadora did not even attempt to sleep. She felt an urgency after all that Ernest had shared at their strange dinner, and while she still hoped a rescue might come, she knew also that she was not willing to leave the matter up to chance. She changed out of the despicable gold gown back into her plain green dress and laced her walking boots on again in case she needed to run. There was a fire in the hearth, set just before she had come back into her room and now smouldering after a few hours untended. She put a few more logs on it and watched the flames lick back to life. By this light, and the added aid of a few candles left in the room, she walked about, examining her prison. There was no window to be seen, which accounted for the dark atmosphere. There were quite a few decorations and tapestries hanging about, but these only seemed to make the room seem darker and heavier. There were no books. After her first pass around the room, Isadora stopped at a hanging beside the fireplace in wonderment, for it suddenly moved as though from a breeze, though there was no window in the room. She thought of the west wing in Duncan's house and pulled aside the tapestry to look behind. There, with the fireplace against one side and a bookshelf on the other, was a small door. It was very low, enough that it would require ducking down to enter, and had a metal handle on it. She reached down and found that, though stiff, the handle turned under her grasp. She held her breath and pushed. The door gave way, and with it came a gust of cold air. She thought at first that she had found a way into the outside, but then she saw the stone walls by light of the candle in her hand, and she realized it was in fact a sort of passageway upon which she had stumbled. She stepped inside before fear could dissuade her, and closed the door behind her. The candle only cast a paltry light, and she had to bend over uncomfortably as the passage narrowed and turned towards the outer edge of the house. A few minutes of walking, and she found she was passing another door. She stopped, and keeping her candle back and out of sight, bent down to peer through the keyhole. She drew back as soon as she looked in, for the door led into Ernest's chambers. He was sitting there at the end of his bed, speaking with a servant in low tones. She shivered at the thought that their rooms could have been thus connected, but then picked up the candle and hurried on before he would think to look in the direction of the door. There was no tapestry blocking her view, and she had no doubt that he knew of it, and intended to use it to get about the house. It was at the far end of the tunnel that she found the last door, this one opening out into the dining room she had left only a little while before. She could tell only by the sound of the servants clearing away the dinner. This doorway, too, was covered by some sort of cloth. She blew out her candle and waited. She had intended to sit there until the servants were done and then escape into the night, but something happened before that could be accomplished. She heard a loud, angry knocking on the front door of the house and a voice demanding entrance. Then there was a great commotion. The servants fled the room. Ernest's voice could be heard threatening everyone to maintain their silence, and the pounding at the door continued. Shaking with fear, Isadora steeled herself for action. If there was someone unwanted at the door, they might be the very people who could help save her. She turned the handle on the hidden doorway and crawled out from behind the tapestry. The dining room was indeed deserted, and the lights blown out. She crept on soft feet to the doorway to listen. "This is most unexpected," Ernest was saying, his voice a lazy and unassuming drawl. "Gentlemen, can I help you? It is a bit late for me to invite you in for dinner, I'm afraid, but I'm sure we could do cigars and sherry another night." "This isn't a joke, Dunmay," came a sharp voice in response. Isadora couldn't place it, but when she peered out through the crack in the door, she saw with a start that it was a constable. Then an even greater surprise greeted her, for a tall figure stepped between the constable and Ernest, rain pouring off his coat and pooling at his feet on the front step. "What have you done with her?" he asked. It was Duncan, here, his eyes flashing with anger, his scar as welcome a sight as every Isadora had seen. He seemed to loom over Ernest, who was himself a tall man. "I don't know what you mean." Ernest looked behind him towards the constables, as though appealing to more rational minds for an explanation. "Gentlemen, if you are going to come here with cryptic sentences and abrupt accusations, I would beg you to do so on a less torrential night, when I might have the benefit of foreknowledge and the comfort of legal representation. As it is, I'll have to ask you to call off your cur and go back into the night empty-handed." "No," Duncan said firmly, "that will not do. I know that you have Isadora Hastings here, that you took her blatantly from her father's doorstep and brought her here against her will. I will not leave until I have her back again." "This is a preposterous allegation," Ernest began, but at that moment Isadora decided that she had heard enough. She stepped out from her hiding place, paused only a moment at the shocked expression on the faces of the constable force and Ernest himself, and then ran into Duncan's arms. "You came," she said, tears running unbidden down her cheeks. "I didn't know if you would, or if I would ever see you again." Ernest was clearly stumbling to overcome the shock of seeing his prisoner escaped from her chamber, and he began speaking quickly, haltingly, attempting to cover for his crime despite all the evidence stacked against him. "Save it," Duncan said quietly, holding Isadora close with one arm while his other went to the firearm at his waist. "I believe the evidence against you is damning, sir. The constable here will arrest you upon charges of kidnapping and other coercive methods, and I believe that will be the end of your tale in these parts." Ernest's face hardened. He stepped forward menacingly. "You don't think you actually have a chance with her, do you?" he hissed. "You're a freak. You don't deserve her." "Of course I don't deserve her," Duncan answered casually, as though Ernest had just made the most obvious of statements. "But I love her, and if I'm very lucky, that may just be enough." Isadora's heart swelled with thankfulness, and she turned her face into Duncan's coat in relief, desired. It was strange to think that the man he had seen tonight, so handsome and wealthy and socially acceptable, should not be at the top of Isadora's list of reputable suitors. But Eliza and Clara had assured him that she had not liked the man, that her father too had turned him away as a potential husband for his daughter. On the surface, Ernest seemed to be all that Duncan was not, and yet Isadora had shown Duncan again and again that she did not care about the surface. He ought not to have been surprised. They were nearly home when she stirred and looked up at him. "You are quiet," she said softly, her eyes luminous and moist in the flickering moonlight that filtered into the carriage. "You were sleeping," he answered. "I was not," she said with a smile, straightening to look at him. "I was resting and thinking and waiting for you to speak." She bit her lip and looked down. "I could not believe my eyes when I first saw you tonight," she said. "I thought I was doomed when Lord Dunmay kidnapped me. But more than that, I thought that I would never see you again." He swallowed hard. "Because of what passed between us during your last visit," he finished for her. She nodded. "I'm so sorry for what I did," she began, but he interrupted her by placing a finger gently on her parted lips. "You have clearly not had a chance in all the excitement to receive or read the letter I wrote to you on the subject," he said with a smile, looking into her eyes. "If you had, you would not be apologizing for something that was clearly my fault and not yours." She shook her head. "No, I went where I was not invited." "And you will never make such a mistake again," he said, taking her hands in his. "For I am now inviting you into every part of my life and heart. I should have done that sooner, but I was too afraid of losing you." He paused, thinking. "And I think I was afraid of losing the last memories of my parents as well." She tilted her head to the side, looking up earnestly into his face. "How could you lose their memories? They are a part of you." "Yes," he answered her with a sad smile. "And the tragedy is a part of me as well. But sometimes I find that when I am away from the home or in the company of you and your family, for a moment, I forget about what happened to them. I fear that greatly." Isadora nodded, tightening her small hands on his and sitting for a moment in the silence of that revelation. Then she raised her chin again and looked at him tenderly. "I am sorry I never knew your parents," she said. "I would have liked to have met them, and I can only make assumptions about their character based on what I know of yours." She bit her lip for a moment and then continued slowly. "Forgive me if I am overstepping with this question, but I would like to know something. Were your mother and father very morose people? Did they cling to the past as you do to yours?" Duncan shook his head slowly. "No, they were full of life and laughter." Isadora smiled at him gently. "I would never want to lose their memory, and I would never want you to sever your connection with them. But I believe you would feel more connected with them if you behaved as they did when they were alive, recognizing the past, but moving on with life and laughter in the future." Duncan felt the truth of her words fill him and set him free. He smiled at her. "I think you are right," he said quietly. Then he leaned forward and looked deeply into her eyes. "I am so sorry, Isadora, for my behaviour to you. I love you more than life itself, and I cannot bear to be without you. Please do not hold those cruel words I spoke against me forever. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me." "I love you too," she answered quickly. "I think I've loved you for some time, but I haven't had the words to admit it even to myself." He drew her close to him in a gentle embrace, and they looked out the window together at the silver moonlight, lighting the last curving of the road towards home. When they at last stopped in front of the Baron's estate, Duncan helped Isadora climb out onto the steps outside. There was a light on in the house, and Duncan guessed that Isadora's family was still up sitting vigil in the hopes that she would be brought back. He paused at the door preparing to knock, and then turned suddenly and looked down at her. "Isadora," he said quietly. "Wait a moment." "Yes?" she asked, pausing innocently in front of him. "Tonight, I thought that I might never see you again," he confessed quietly. "It was a great shock to me, to realize in the same moment that I needed you in my life, but that I could never have you. It frightened me." "That's all over now," she said, pressing his hand and smiling. "You've brought me safely home." "Yes," he said, "but I cannot run the risk of losing you again. Ever." He swallowed hard. "I hope you do not think me too forward in asking such a thing of you, but I cannot wait another moment. Please, Isadora, consider marrying me. Then I will no longer have to leave you or risk being without you. I will speak to your father. I will ensure everything is done in the proper ways, and I will make you feel like the most treasured of women." He dipped his head down, thinking of the scar for the first time that night. "I know that it is a difficult thing to imagine, yoking yourself forever to a man who is as disfigured as I. But I ask you to at least consider it. Perhaps you can love me despite my scars." She looked up at him with luminescent eyes. "You are so gifted at loving," she said tenderly, "but you are not always so ready to be loved in return. You think so ill of yourself, and you do not allow those who are closest to you to think well of you." "I am ready for you to love me," he said hoarsely, "and you alone." She reached up and put her hand gently on his face, her fingers touching his skin so lightly that he could hardly feel them. They were healing fingers, and they sent a thrill through his body. "I refuse to love you in spite of your scars," she said with a teasing smile. "Your scars are part of your story, and your entire story makes you who you are. I love you in entirety, scars and all. Now that I have known you, I would never be satisfied with another." He felt hot tears pricking his eyes at her words. It was too beautiful, more than he could ever have asked for. She stood on her toes suddenly and, putting her hands gently on his face, tipped her head up to be kissed. He kissed her gently, and when he stepped away, he saw tears shining in her eyes as well. "Is that a yes?" he asked hopefully. "Of course it is," she answered with a happy smile. The door was suddenly wrenched open beside them, and there in the golden light from inside stood Clara and Eliza and the Baron, all breathless with relief and happiness at the sight of the couple standing safely outside. In the flurry of embraces and explanations that followed, the Baron pulled Duncan aside and smiled at him knowingly. "Do not think I am so dense as to miss the look on my daughter's face when I opened the door," he said to Duncan. "You and I should talk later." Duncan nodded. "Of course, sir." The Baron shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "But if our conversation has anything to do with the way you have made my daughter sparkle with joy this evening, then I think we will both find the outcome agreeable, lad." Duncan looked across the room at Isadora, who met his eyes with open joy and delight. "Most agreeable indeed," he said softly. Epilogue. 3 years later. "You will be staying in the garden rooms," Isadora said to Clara, showing her to her chambers. It was a year after Clara's wedding to Lord Wellington, and the new couple had come, blushing and delighted, to stay for a few weeks at the Grant estate with Isadora and Duncan. There is an attached solar and direct access to the walking paths outside, so you should find plenty to delight you, she said with a smile. Clara's face was wreathed with smiles and she blushed. I am so glad to finally be seeing you, she said. Daniel insisted on such a long wedding trip, and though I was delighted to see Europe in its entirety, I found myself missing our quiet evenings with Father. Did you hear about Eliza? She is to be married to some man from northern England, I hear. I worry about Father being without her, although I hear that the gentleman in question is above reproach. Then you have not heard the most recent news, Isadora said with a smile of her own. Father is planning on moving in here with us. We are expanding and mending the western side of the manor so that he will be able to live there in safety and comfort. Clara sighed happily. That is a relief indeed. I know that he loves all his new sons, but I know that a part of him misses those quiet days when we used to sit at his feet and read poetry aloud. He will be here tonight for dinner, Isadora said. Perhaps we could induce him to sit for another reading. The two sisters walked arm in arm down the hall and towards the parlour. There was the sound of merriment coming from within, and even before Isadora turned the corner, she heard shrieks of childish delight that brought a smile to her lips. It was a familiar sound these days, the sound of her little boy, 2-year-old Edward, frolicking about the room in his father's arms. Duncan paused when she came in, setting the boy down and raising his eyebrows in her direction with a smile. Are they all quite settled? He asked. Daniel was sitting by his side, a book open but unread in his hand. They are, Isadora answered, coming to perch beside her husband on a nearby settee. But I would like very much to show them what you are doing with the western wing, if you have the energy and desire. She had seen her husband blossom over the past few years as he went about the project that, for so long, had filled him with thoughts of fear and regret. Duncan seemed eager, now that the decision to execute construction on the burnt visage of the building had finally been made, and he was there on the site every day with the labourers, helping where he could and giving directions. He had told Isadora on more than one occasion that it felt like a kind of balm in and of itself, putting things to right again that had been so horribly lost. I have energy enough, he said, swinging Edward up onto his shoulders and striding off towards the western side of the house. But you all must follow close at hand, or risk falling behind. Clara and Isadora exchanged smiles and hurried to catch up, with Daniel close behind. They came to the end of the hall where a refinished banister led upwards through a hall completely cleaned of the signs of soot and disrepair that Isadora had seen when she first ventured upstairs. Now the wood was polished and elegant. The wallpaper was new and detailed to coordinate with the drapes of 2 large windows at the top of the staircase. When they had climbed up, they turned towards the western wing. Isadora had seen the progress many times herself, but still she resisted the urge to gasp in delight and surprise at the change that had overtaken the wing. What had once been burnt and skeletal was now full of fresh wood and furnishings. Construction was still underway, but instead of beams blackened by fire, there were new sawn frames and beams waiting for walls and floors. Everything looked strong and fresh and full of promise. A few rooms had already been completed, and these were the ones Duncan led them into now, pointing out where the Baron Hastings would be living and where he might have his own private library. Are you going to take books from the Grand Library downstairs? Clara asked, shooting a teasing glance in Isadora's direction. I know that she does not easily part with her books. They are Duncan's books, Isadora corrected her sister. But no, we will not have to part with them. Father is bringing his entire library here as well to fill the space. We have also allowed him to decorate and design as he wishes, so that he will feel most at home. Duncan came over to stand near his wife, letting Edward slip down onto the floor. He put an arm around Isadora and pulled her close, looking down at her tenderly. You are mistaken, my love, he said gently. Though I do not wish to argue with you, I would be remiss if I did not note that the library downstairs became yours the day you married me. Every book in there belongs to you, and always will." Isadora blushed with delight, as she always did when reminded of this fact. "There will be more rooms too," Duncan went on, pointing towards the downstairs and furthermost corner of the house, so that when people come to visit they might stay as well. "We want this to be a place of welcome." "And at the end of the hall," Isadora added, "we will have 2 large portraits of Duncan's parents, the former Lord and Lady Grant. We believe that having this place full of family and the future would honour them, and out of respect we are keeping their memories close to this wing." She exchanged a glance with Duncan, and then looked down at the floor, her heart stopping. "Where's Edward?" she asked, turning around. He was tottering far from them, dangerously close to the unfinished part of the construction. Duncan was there in a few steps, his long limbs bringing him close at hand to sweep Edward up and away from harm. Clara came over and took the boy, scolding him gently with her finger. "No, Edward," she said. "That western wing is off limits, I'm afraid. It's far too dangerous for you." Duncan watched with a half-smile, and then slipped back to Isadora's side as the group walked back downstairs together. Clara and Daniel continued on down the hall, chatting to their nephew playfully, but Duncan put out a hand to Isadora's elbow and pulled her up short. "Wait," he said softly. She did so, surprised. "I only wanted to clarify," he sent on, looking at her in that way that made her knees melt and her heart beat more quickly, "that what your sister said is not strictly true anymore. The West Wing is no longer off limits. You have brought what is the most dead and frightening in my heart back to the light again, and every part of our home is now open and accessible." She stood up and kissed him lightly on the lips. "Coming to visit you was the best decision I ever made," she said, "even if you were a bit gruff upon our first introduction." He kissed her back, winding his fingers gently into hers. "And upon our later meetings, if I remember correctly." "You didn't want to make it too easy for me," she said, biting her lip playfully. "I needn't have tried to push you away," he said. "You always did have a gift for seeing the man behind the beast." The end. Click on the first in the comments or scan the QR code and read the Broken Dukes and Charming Ladies box set.
Click on the link in the description to read the next book in the series. Share this video with your friend or watch on of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.